You know, we live in a country built on grit, talent, and hard work, right? And it works. We're taught at a very young age to believe that we can do anything, right? We're encouraged to believe in ourselves and to trust that if we just commit to it, if we just believe we're strong enough, there's nothing that we can't do, nothing we can't accomplish. There are new books and resources coming out every year that encourage us along that line, that support those assumptions. You can buy a book called High Performance Habits on Amazon for just $18.35. And if you read that book and study it closely, you can learn ways to make the most of every moment of your day. And if you can do that, you can become extremely productive, very high-performance individual. For $19.99, you can take a famous test. It's called the Strength Finders test. You heard of it? This test helps you determine where your strengths are. And the hope is that if you could find those strengths, you can design through the test a workout routine, a routine that would kind of surround you with your strengths and help you become more productive. You can watch Dave Ramsey and find ways to save money, or tune into the Ken Coleman Show and learn his proximity principle. You familiar with that principle? It tells us that if you spend time with the right people, the type of people that you want to become, according to this principle, you will eventually become who you want to be and be as strong as they are. All of these books, they're really actually pretty good. I've read many of them. I've been encouraged to take a lot of those tests. $20 seems a little much for me. But they offer us solutions. Solutions to our weaknesses. They do that by capitalizing on our strengths. But you know, even after you read the books, right, and you take all the tests, and you work towards all their solutions, you are still just a person. You're only human, right? And there are some things that are just out of your control. No matter how hard you work, you can't lift a mountain. No matter how much you commit to it, you can't bring the moon closer. You can push yourselves, and sometimes you can get pretty far. But no matter how hard you push yourself, sometimes it's just too hard to get out of bed. It's just too hard to get that project in on time. You might think you can do the impossible, but none of us can snap our fingers. None of us can change our life, even though we think we can. Parents can't make their kids turn out a certain way. Students can't guarantee that they're going to understand the study material, no matter how hard they study. You may hate to admit it, but some things are out of your control. There are circumstances that are too hard for you to overcome. Things that are just beyond your power. What about God? Is there anything that's beyond his power? What can God not do? You know, skeptics, they like to create paradoxes. I don't know if you've heard them. Paradoxes that help them question God's ability. You ever heard any of them? Here's one, the popular one that everyone loves to bring up. Can God create a stone so heavy that he can't lift? Because if he can, then he's created something more powerful than himself. And is he really all that powerful? Questions like, can God make a square circle? If he can't, then obviously he has limits, right? How about the question that here's one, can God do something or make something unknowable? or something that's beyond comprehension. Because if he can, God has limits. He can't know everything. And if he can't, is he really all-powerful? Paradoxes. You know, these are fun for them to play with our minds, right? But they really don't tell you the real question to be asking, because the real question to skeptics like that is not whether God can do something like that. It's really whether God would. Would God, being all-powerful, make something more powerful than himself? Would God make something that he couldn't know? Of course he wouldn't. Doesn't make sense. But they're paradoxes, right? And it's fun for skeptics to play with God that way. But all the paradoxes aside, is there anything God cannot do? Is there any limit to his power? What is beyond God's control? It's an important question. You know, it's one that God asks each one of us. And it's the one he asks Sarah in our text today. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? We're in Genesis 18. Last time we were in this study, we finished up Genesis 17, where we read the sign of God's covenant that he made with Abraham. Now, finally can say his name. Abraham, not Abram. And Sarah, not Sarai. They've received some new names, some signs of the promises that God has made to them. And we saw the sign of circumcision. We pick up in Genesis 18, not too far after Genesis 17. And we know that because of the promise that God reiterates here. It's very similar to the one he mentioned in 17, and we'll look at that in a moment. But our story begins in Genesis 18, one late afternoon. Abraham was sitting in the shade near the trees of Mamre. There he is in the heat of the day, sitting, waiting, thinking. If you've ever been to Israel, you know it can get really hot, reach well over 100 degrees. I know each one of us knows exactly what that feels like, so I'm not going to get into it. I've been to Arizona in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the summer, and wow, talk about heat. I think it was 127 degrees one time when we were there. It was just, I think that was it, maybe a little bit of hyperbole. It felt like 127 degrees. Verse 1 tells us that he was sitting in the door of the tent in the heat of the day. All of us here in Florida can imagine what that felt like. I grew up in southern Florida. I know what heat is like. Abraham, he's trying to keep cool, and the text tells us here that as he sat in his tent, in verse 1, that the Lord appeared to him as he was sitting in the door of the tent. Now, as I read this passage, I really doubt that Abraham knew this was the Lord, at least right here at this point. He's sitting here and he lifts his head up, and suddenly he sees these three men walking by. Verse 2, he lifted up his eyes and looked. And behold, three men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. I don't think he knew who these men really were. They weren't wearing halos or sporting wings. They don't look particularly heavenly at this point. They don't appear any different from other travelers that would have been passing through Israel. They're just three ordinary, everyday travelers. And as soon as Abraham sees them, he runs out to greet them. Abraham gets to the group, he approaches them, and he calls out to the leader. He calls him my Lord. It's kind of like some of us today, we would say, sir, how are you? Or, sir, is there anything I can do for you? Someone in a restaurant. My Lord, he said, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Verse 4, please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. After that you may pass by. Inasmuch as you have come to your servant, they said, do as you have said. Abraham, he wastes no time. But when you read what he does here, I mean, he goes all out. He doesn't just make a couple of sandwiches and chips. He makes a real spread for these guys. He's on top of everything to make sure these guests have everything they need. And that's how Bedouin's hospitality worked. You didn't just let someone pass by. No, you took care of them. It was the custom to be concerned for travelers and to meet their needs. And Abraham is concerned for these men. And look at his speed, though. You see it from verses 6 through 8, it says he hurried. And then you see how he instructs Sarah to be quick. And then you see him running. And then again, he hastens back to them. In verse 6, so Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. That is a lot of flour. 3 measures. I think that's, in our terms, like 36 pounds of flour. Can you imagine, even without the leaven, can you imagine how many, what is it, nines they say? How many? Almost like a 9. How much bread that would have been. And for her to make this in the hottest point of the day, at noon, this would have been hard at any time. But can you picture Sarah in the center of the tent, at the heat of the day, at noon, when the sun is right in the center, baking hot bread? And yet she did it. Despite all the heat, she kneaded it and baked it in the middle of the tent, in the middle of the day. She prepares all of that bread. Aren't you glad for AC? Wow. Well, while all that's going on, verse 7 says, and Abraham ran to the herd. He took a tender and a good calf and gave it to the young men and hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them. And verse 8 reads that he stood by them as they ate. I can see Abraham here, like a good waiter, waiting to serve, like at a fancy restaurant, just standing there, trying to meet the needs of his 3 guests. He had the heart of a servant, and he wanted to please those visitors. But what were they doing here? I mean, what's the purpose of the visit, right? I mean, here they are enjoying this meal together. You can imagine Abraham looking at these guys, putting his head to the tent, asking Sarah, something strange about these guys, these visitors. What was the purpose for their visit? It couldn't just be for some food, right? They weren't just here for a social call to pass the time of the day. These men hadn't just stopped by for lunch. God had sent them, and we know that. And he'd sent them for a reason. And that becomes pretty clear when we get to verse 9. Because one of the messengers puts forth a question. It's a pretty odd question. Verse 9, then they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? Now, how did these guys know he had a wife? That's interesting because in the custom of the day, Sarah would not have been out there eating with them. She would have stayed in the tent while Abraham cared for the guests. She could have been anybody in the tent, though. Any servant could have been making the food. Why were they asking for his wife? And how did they know he had a wife? More importantly, though, how did they know her name? God had just changed her name, remember in Genesis 17? So she hasn't had this name for very long. What is going on? He said, here in the tent. And then we read the words in verse 10. These words that draw us back to God's promise to Abraham back in Genesis 17. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Those words, they sound a lot like an echo of something we just heard last time we were studying, don't they? Something God had already told Abraham. And then you read at the end of verse 10 something that God's storyteller just kind of sticks in there for us. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. And as you read that, you start to realize something. That those words, they weren't really for Abraham at all, were they? God had already told this to Abraham. That promise was for Sarah. You see, up to now, Sarah had relied on her husband to remind her of God's promises. But after all these years of hearing God's word from coming through her husband, for the very first time, Sarah herself, with her own 2 ears, heard the promise of God that she would bear a son. But not just a son at any time, this time next year. But in her mind, it was 24 years too late. Verse 11, now Abraham and Sarah, another nugget the storyteller sticks in there for us readers. They were old, well advanced in years, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. She's probably thinking, after all these years and years of waiting, am I to have a baby now? I mean, this is crazy. Abraham's got Alzheimer's or something. What's going on? He thinks we're going to have children in our 90s. It's too much for her to hold in. And in verse 12, she laughs within herself, saying, after I've grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? 90-year-old women don't have kids. And what about my husband? What about Abraham? He's way too old to be a father. This might have been possible, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but this time next year, give me a break. Suppose we did have a baby. Parenting is a young person's job. Imagine the baby starting to walk and run. How am I supposed to keep up with the little tyke? Sarah can't hold back chuckles, sitting here in the tent with her ears perked up, listening to this promise. And she laughs. And when she laughs in her heart, in the privacy of her own thoughts, these 3 messengers hear her. And then it all starts to make sense. And finally, in verse 13, we find the truth. And the Lord said to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh? He doesn't just know her chuckle. He knows the question she asked herself in her heart. Well, why did she laugh? What was her question? Surely I shall bear a child since I'm old. Knowing Sarah's name was one thing, though. These men, they said, where is Sarah, your wife? But now, these messengers can hear her thoughts. And in that moment, they knew these were not any travelers. These were messengers from the Lord. And you think about that verse in Hebrews, which really I believe is speaking of this particular passage. Sometimes we entertain angels unawares. And now it's revealed to them. Just as those disciples walking on the road of Emmaus that we studied several months back, their eyes are opened and they recognize who they're with. We tend to be pretty hard on Sarah in this text. At least I have. But it really was a crazy idea. And the fact that the storyteller sticks that in there for us, that they were well beyond their age of bearing children, tells us that this was lunacy. And for anybody else, if it had come from anyone else's lips, it really would have been impossible. But when it comes from God, it's possible. And what Sarah and what Abraham needed to learn that as crazy as it may sound, as far-fetched as you might think it was, when God makes a promise, it's a promise you can count on, Christian. When God makes a promise, he keeps his word. Then we come to verse 13. And it's here where God counters Sarah's own question that came in her heart with a question of his own. And it's a question that it might even be the most important verse in Genesis, definitely in this passage, probably the most important question in the Bible, or along with them. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah? Is there anything beyond my power? Is placing a child in your womb in your 90s really too hard for me? He tells Abraham in the next verse, at the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life. And Sarah will have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, oh no, but you did laugh. But you know what encourages me here? And what really ought to encourage you? We say that these texts, these stories, they really are theology. They teach us about God. And that's what the Bible is. It's a book that teaches us not really about Sarah or about Abraham, but it teaches us more about God. And in this text, I recognize something about God. I recognize that even after Sarah laughs at him, God is still patient with her. Do you see that? Even after she laughs at God, he still keeps his promise. You know, most of those who are in power or authority, they wouldn't tolerate someone mocking them or laughing at them. And yet, in verse 14, God still promises to bless Sarah with a son, even after she laughed at him. God is all-powerful, yes, but look at his patience and his long-suffering to his people. That question that's asked here in the passage today, is anything too hard for the Lord? It's the same question that we're faced with time and again. It's the same question that Israel faced as they departed Egypt and as they stood by the Red Sea with nowhere to go. It was the same question they had to ask themselves every day for that 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. Every morning waiting for God to send manna. Is it too hard for the Lord this time? Is anything too hard for God? God who created the universe, who lit the stars and who keeps them burning every day. Is there something that is too hard for him? God who destroyed the world by a flood, who confounded the languages of the world there at Babel. Is there anything too hard for him? Job's answer in Job 42, verse 2 to that question is a resounding no. He says, I know that you can do everything, Lord, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You know, I think Jeremiah's answer is even better than that. In Jeremiah 32, verse 17, the question is asked in this chapter, the very same question, is anything too hard for the Lord? And Jeremiah's answer is, Lord God, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. What about Gabriel's answer in the Gospel of Luke? In Luke chapter 1, he's standing there with a young virgin, and he's just told her that she will soon bear a son, the very Son of God, while she is still a virgin. And Gabriel's answer to her in chapter 1, verse 37, when she says, how can this be? His answer is this: with God, nothing will be impossible. Mary, there is nothing too hard for him, nothing too hard for the Lord. He is God, and he can do whatever he wants. And that's the point. That's the question, the answer to the question that God is asking in Genesis 18. And as 2 Timothy 2:13 reminds us, when God makes a promise, you can be sure that he will fulfill it. He will remain faithful to his word because he cannot deny himself. You know, when you and I got saved and we started out on our Christian life, in order to come to the Lord with childlike faith, we had to believe that God could do those things that he promised. We believed that God could do amazing things, didn't we? But you know, the same God that made it possible for you and I to have a relationship with him, That same God who sees and who hears Hagar in her distress back in Genesis 16. The same God who can hear the thoughts of Sarah in this passage here. He's the same God who would later enter the world as a man. He's the same God who would die on a cross in our place. He's the same God who worked miracles in our life when we got saved. That same God is the God that is here with us today. He's never left us. He's never forsaken us. And whatever you may be facing, and whatever you will face in the days to come, Christian, can I remind you that we serve a God who can do anything? And He will do everything that He's promised. Why not step back and sit still and just remember who we're dealing with? Remember who God is as we go home today. Why not believe that God can do anything again? Because He is still God. And He can still do amazing things in your